First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this International Carbohydrate Quality Consortium meeting, especially to Libya for inviting me to talk about legume consumption and risk of type 2 diabetes in individuals at high cardiovascular risk. Here you have my disclosures. As you know, diabetes is an important public health problem with more than 400 million of people affected of this disease in 2015, and it is expected in 2040 an increase to more than 600 million of people. The prevalence of type 2 diabetes is increasing in parallel to obesity epidemics. It's a potent risk factor for cardiovascular disease, but also blindness, renal failure, and lower limb amputation, decreasing the quality of life of people affected. It's responsible for 5% of total mortality, and in the next 10 years, it is expected that total mortality increases by 50%. As you know, there are several risk factors for diabetes. For example, low physical activity, smoking, overweight, an unhealthy diet, and alcohol intake that is modulated by the genetic background, so inducing the risk of diabetes. Several nutrients or food have been implicated in this risk of diabetes, and here you have, for example, that a diet, a low glycemic index diet, or a diet that is rich in fiber or magnesium and antioxidants, decrease the risk of insulin resistance and secretion, inducing decreasing the risk of diabetes through several possible mechanisms, for example, through oxidation, inflammation, etc. And there are other nutrients that have been positively related to this increase in the risk of diabetes. And legumes is a food group that has a low glycemic index because has a high amount of amylose starch, resistant starch, and viscose fiber. Has high amounts of vegetable proteins, but also several minerals such as calcium, potassium, or magnesium that has been inversely related to the risk of diabetes, and several phytochemicals. So by different mechanisms, you can explain, as you can see here, for example, decreasing the absorption of starch, or decreasing the postprandial glycemia, or inducing satiety, or reducing blood pressure, or decreasing LDL cholesterol. We can, these are potential mechanisms decreasing the risk of diabetes, but also metabolic syndrome, hypertension, or cardiovascular disease. First of all, I would like to differentiate between pulses and legumes. Legumes refers to plants whose fruit is enclosed in a pod, but pulses are part of the legume family, but refers only to the dried seed. So pulses do not include fresh beans or peas. So we are here with a food group that in some cases when we talk about pulses, in some cases we talk about legumes, in some cases all the analyses include soybean or peanuts that have a completely different food composition. In order to talk about legumes and diabetes, I think it's important to talk about the studies that have been analyzed, postprandial glycemia, but also those studies related to body weight or satiety, because this could be a mediator of this relationship between legume consumption and diabetes, and also the glycemic control. It is highly recognized that dietary legumes slow digestion and decrease postprandial glucose response, and here we have a paper published in Diabetologia by the group of David Jenkins, demonstrating that in this case lentils decrease the rate of digestion of carbohydrates, but also reduce the postprandial glycemia. And here you have another one. So comparing different the postprandial glycemic response of different foods, and here you have the legumes. So it is highly recognized that compared to other sources of carbohydrates, legumes slow digestion and absorption of starch and reduce postprandial glycemia. In relation to body weight, we have this meta-analysis conducted also by the group of Toronto. They screened a lot of studies, and after screening these randomized controlled trials, they select 19 trials. And as you can see here, they have analyzed the effect of pulses consumption on body weight in these clinical trials in the context of negative energy balance studies or neutral energy balance studies. And as you can see in this slide, it has been observed an inverse association between pulses consumption and body weight with low heterogeneity, as you can see here. So they conclude that the inclusion of dietary legumes in a diet may be beneficial weight loss strategy because it leads to a modest weight loss effect, even when diets are not intended to be calorically restricted. Now I would like to show you another meta-analysis conducted by the same group. I think all the meta-analyses in relation to this are, well, more than half of the meta-analyses are conducted by the same group. In this case, in relation to randomized controlled experimental trials in individuals with or without diabetes, and in this case the endpoint is the glycemic control. And they selected 11 trials analyzing the effect of pulses alone in the context of low glycemic index and in the context of high fiber diets. And here you have the results. They have analyzed the effects on fasting glucose, fasting insulin, insulin resistance measured by HOMA, and glycated proteins. And the results of this meta-analysis in general demonstrated that pulses alone or in the context of a low glycemic index diet or a high fiber diet improve markers of long-term glycemic control in humans with the extent of improvement subject to significant inter-study heterogeneity. So, and they say that it's necessary to have large clinical trials designed for this in order to demonstrate this effect. And here you have the results of diabetes. I show you another meta-analysis conducted by a German group. Of this meta-analysis is a meta-analysis of prospective studies, and as you can see here, the results of these 12 studies that had been selected with more than 26,000 cases of diabetes demonstrate that legume consumption is not associated with type 2 diabetes risk. So, but as you can see here, with a high heterogeneity between the studies, and the same authors say that one of the problems probably is to compare different types of studies, analyzing, for example, soya consumption in some cases, other non-soya legumes, in other cases, pulses and other total legumes, and in some studies also include peanuts as legumes. And another problem is that in most of the studies, the consumption of legumes is very, very, very low, ranging in this meta-analysis from 0 to 190 grams, and in most of these studies, this consumption is very low, so difficulting to see any association. One of the questions that we made some years ago is, does regular legume consumption in the context of Mediterranean diet reduce the risk of diabetes in individuals at high cardiovascular risk, in individuals without diabetes at baseline? And as you know, we have the results of the cohort, of the PREDIMED cohort. I remember that this PREDIMED trial is conducted in individuals between 55 and 80 years at high cardiovascular risk because they have type 2 diabetes or different cardiovascular risk factors, as you can see here. And we have randomized these individuals to 2 Mediterranean diet groups, and we compare this to a low-fat diet following the instructions of the American Heart Association some years ago. And in this context, in both Mediterranean diet groups, we recommend to follow a Mediterranean Mediterranean diet. So, and one of the items in order to increase this adherence to the Mediterranean diet was legumes. In this clinical trial, as you know, we have demonstrated that those individuals randomized to the Mediterranean diet, to both Mediterranean diet, they experiment a decrease in the relative incidence of cardiovascular disease, diabetes in this case, compared to the control group. So in this case, we try to examine the association between the consumption of total legumes and its specific subtypes and type 2 diabetes risk, and also to investigate the theoretically substitution effects of legumes for other protein sources or other carbohydrate-rich foods. And so with only the population that didn't have diabetes at baseline. And we have analyzed these associations as an observational prospective analysis in the context of the PREDIMED study, analyzing this association between total legumes, lentils, chickpeas, beans, and fresh peas, and diabetes, with a median follow-up of 4.3 years. And here you can see the results and the multivariate Cox regressions, and we have observed an inverse association between total legume consumption and type 2 diabetes incidence, as you can see here. And also this was observed for lentils and near to the significance in case of the chickpeas, but not for dry beans and fresh peas. And also we have conducted this substitution analysis, and we have demonstrated that the theoretically substitution of legumes for other protein sources, rich protein sources or foods, such as, for example, eggs, fish, or meat, or other foods rich in carbohydrate, is associated with a lower risk of type 2 diabetes in this population at high cardiovascular risk. Another question is that if legume consumption have additional benefits in terms of cardiovascular disease and mortality. And also this has been analyzed, especially by the group of Toronto, with using meta-analysis, and it has demonstrated an inverse association between legume consumption and LDL cholesterol in blood or blood pressure as cardiovascular risk factors. And also there are several meta-analyses demonstrating beneficial effects on cardiovascular disease risk and coronary heart risk, but not in case of stroke, as you can see in this these different meta-analyses of different studies that has been published in Annals of New York Academic Science this year. It's a very important, I think, review in relation to this, conducted also by the group of Toronto. And here you have another result that appeared this year, is the peer study, also the results of this large cohort. And they have analyzed this association between legume consumption and cardiovascular outcomes in this case, and they have observed an inverse association between legume consumption and major cardiovascular disease, but not for myocardial infarction and stroke. I remember that this population is a mix of population of diabetic and non-diabetic individuals. And also with cardiovascular mortality, and they didn't observe any association between legume consumption and this outcome, but also they have observed for total mortality. And the final question is, does legume consumption have additional benefits in terms of cardiovascular mortality in participants with diabetes? Also, we have a prospective study analyzing this in the context of the EPIC study. And in this study, with more than 10,000 diabetic participants and with a mean follow-up of 9 years, they demonstrated that in individuals with diabetes, total legume consumption was associated to a lower risk of mortality and cardiovascular mortality. So we can conclude that legume consumption has demonstrated beneficial effects in reducing postprandial glycemia when substituting other refined carbohydrates. Frequent consumption of legumes could prevent type 2 diabetes development in senior adults at high cardiovascular risk. However, this was not proved in healthy people. Dietary legumes result in a clinically meaningful improvement in blood sugar control. The substitution of legumes for other proteins or carbohydrate-rich foods is also associated with a lower risk of diabetes in individuals at high cardiovascular risk. Dietary legumes benefit other important markers of cardiovascular disease, including body weight, blood lipid levels, and blood pressure, and are associated with a decreased risk of cardiovascular disease in diabetic but also non-diabetic participants. But in order to confirm the results, we need more research, more large clinical trials in order to demonstrate this with quality clinical trials, and also to understand these findings through the mechanisms. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jordi. A very nice follow-up with Monica, both we can say from the PREDIMED Spanish group.